Gary. Can I say it's a delight, not just because the weather's so great this morning, but to be here. As I was saying to the Vice-Chancellor and Dermot earlier on, it's quite nostalgic for me coming to this building because my father trained as a teacher here over 80 years ago. So it's a sort of emotional moment for me. And of course, Wales is a very different place than it was in the 1930s, because then right in the middle of the Depression, although obviously Wales has suffered really difficult times in the last few years. Can I also just pay tribute, just following what the Vice-Chancellor said, pay tribute to Dermot and his team. Certainly when I was in government and responsible for procurement for about 5 or 6 years, the research and advice that I and government had from Dermot was absolutely crucial. And government policy now, Welsh government policy, has been fundamentally influenced by the work that Dermot and Gary and the team have done. And of course, declaring interest, I'm on the steering committee of the winning and tendering project, which I know you'll hear more about today and over the next few days. The Vice-Chancellor just mentioned, with the public sector, particularly in this part of Wales and in my part of Wales in Swansea, where 40% of the workforce in Swansea work in the public sector. And the public sector is probably even more dominant in this part of Wales than in mine. How we can grow the private sector, work with the public sector and government, local government, working collaboratively is going to be very important indeed. We all hear stories of public contracts in Wales being won by non-Wales-based companies. The Vice-Chancellor himself just said about the new construction project here, not even where a Wales-based company didn't bid. Unfortunately, that is often the case. And one of the problems we found in the research that Dermot and his team found with the barriers to procurement report, which I'll come on to in a bit, was that in many cases the procurement process is so complex that it actually stops or prevents many smaller Wales-based companies even bidding for those contracts. And of course, the barriers to procurement report, one of the recommendations is that the public procurement process be simplified and streamlined. But just to give you a scale of the business that's opportunities in Wales, the UK, or indeed across the European Union. The public sector in Wales, that's Welsh Government, local government, 22 local authorities, the various local health boards, colleges, universities, spend, well now with public expenditure cuts, about 4.3 or between 4.3 and 4.5 billion pounds worth on buying goods and services every year. To put that into perspective, that's about 10% of Wales's national wealth, or the GVA, gross domestic product. So it shows that this is actually a very substantial amount of work. And that's everything from construction through to IT equipment, stationery, and a whole range of goods and services that the public sector buy or procure every year. Now, we had a rough rule of thumb in government that for every 1% of that additional expenditure that could be won by Wales-based companies, I use that phrase, by the way, Wales-based companies, because obviously a lot of companies in Wales are not Welsh as such, but nevertheless, if they're based in Wales, they employ local people, they put money into the regional local economy. But we calculated that for every 1% of that expenditure that companies in Wales could win, it would be equivalent to 2,000 jobs. Now that is a very substantial contribution, and that is just employment. That's not taking into account profits or wealth creation for companies based here. Now, we've made substantial progress in Wales. When we first did a survey around about 2003-04, there were about a third of that, between 4 and 4.5 billion, was won by Wales-based companies. And we managed through a whole range of activities, encouraging people to apply, explaining the procurement process, making the system much more transparent. We bumped that up from a third to about a half. I don't know if Welsh Government is going to be doing another survey shortly, but as you can see, that's quite a substantial progress. But obviously, Wales, it's big business. In the UK, it's even bigger. If you take across the whole of the United Kingdom, public procurement market is worth £175 billion a year. Now, obviously, with reduced public expenditure across the UK, it means that that piece of the cake has shrunk, and many companies are finding it harder to win contracts. But there isn't any evidence, in fact, that Wales-based companies are not winning contracts. And in fact, of the recent surveys that were done, 3,400 suppliers were winning the smaller contracts between 150,000 and 5 million. Nearly 60% were SMEs, and just over half of those were Wales-based companies. So I've lost the bottom of the slide, I'm afraid. The big challenge, however, is for contracts over 10 million, the larger contracts, many of which are construction contracts, only 3 out of 11 suppliers were Wales-based. So Wales-based companies are more successful in winning smaller contracts, less successful in winning the larger contracts, many of them construction contracts. And obviously, part of the problem for that is large construction companies. We don't often have many large or medium-sized Wales-based companies. If you look across the European Union, about 20% of public expenditure on goods and services, about a fifth, is covered by European directives. That is in terms of the free market, in terms of the necessity for open procurement and advertising. In 2009, just over 15,000 invitations to tender were published, with an estimated value of 420, I think it should be euros there. In the period between 2007 and 9, 1.6% of procurement contracts in terms of the number, but 3.5% in terms of value, were awarded to companies in other member states. So that basically means that very few contracts were either being bid for or indeed won by companies in other countries. So most procurement is actually done within each member state. So French public sector tends to buy French, German tends to buy German, etc. Now those were the direct procurement. There was indirect. For example, large multinationals, through their subsidiaries, were winning a larger proportion of the contracts. So about just under 11.5%. In the UK, despite some of the myths you hear about Britain being very open to competition and therefore losing a lot of contracts, in fact, only 1.5% of direct contracts to other member states, although it was just a slightly higher proportion went to subsidiaries of larger companies. So in the UK, a slightly larger proportion went to indirect contracts than the EU average, but nevertheless, still the bulk of business is won by companies within each member state. You hear about contracts being won by companies elsewhere. There was obviously controversy some time ago about the rail company losing British-based, although it isn't actually a British company, Bombardier losing to Siemens, and Andrew Lister is here. I'll give him another plug. He's speaking later. He's head of procurement for Siemens. Will be talking later. But nevertheless, it ignores the fact that many European contracts are actually won by UK companies. So yes, sometimes UK companies miss out, but nevertheless, in many cases, more often than not, they're winning more business across the EU. But of course, German companies are being even more successful. German economy is much more export focused even than the UK, or more successful in the export market. So it's not surprising in a way that they're winning more of those overseas cross-border contracts. It's interesting, 75% of Irish awards, public sector awards, are going to UK companies. So that gives you an idea of not just the UK or indeed the Welsh procurement market, but also the EU market. As I said, this report, which I commissioned when I was a minister into procurement, basically looked at what were the barriers facing small and medium-sized enterprises in Wales trying to gain access to that £4.5 billion worth of business. Firstly, the complexity of the public sector procurement process. It isn't just procurement, by the way. I heard of a company recently that was bidding for financial support from Welsh Government, where their finance director told me it took him 20 days to go through the application process. Now, that is a very significant cost. Now, this was a large Dutch multinational. We were talking over dinner last night of research I think Dermot and his team have done, which said that the average cost for a small company bidding for a public contract in Wales is £5,000. Now, if you're a small company, that is quite a significant cost to bear. One, if you don't win the contract, and secondly, even if you do win the contract, that could actually be your profit margin gone. So again, the very complexity of the procurement process is a significant barrier. I know, and probably many of you also know, of companies in Wales that don't even bother now to bid for contracts because for that very reason, it takes too long and it's too complex. This is something you'll hear in procurement jargon, pre-qualification questionnaire. I often think when it comes to public procurement, it's a bit like a famous historical study called the Schleswig-Holstein question in mid-19th century Europe, what is now Denmark and northern Germany. And it was said that the Schleswig-Holstein question was so complex that only 3 people had ever understood it. One was dead, one had gone mad, and the third person couldn't remember what it was all about in the first place. And I sometimes think that procurement is a bit like this. But the pre-qualification questionnaire is basically the information that contractors or bidders have to fill in for the public body. The problem we have in Wales is not only the complexity, but the massive duplication. In fact, the report that Dermot commissioned with his colleagues showed that actually most of the information that's required in a PQQ is standard. Nevertheless, nearly every public body, 22 local authorities, health service, whatever, expect each bidder to enter their own PQQ. Actually, most of that can be standardised, and really only a small amount of the PQQ or the information that's required for a specific contract is necessary. There's a lack of transparency in the evaluation and feedback process. In many cases, companies have no idea at all why they failed either to get onto the shortlist or indeed to win the process, the bidding process. Unfortunately, because of the cuts in public expenditure, there seems to be evidence that a lot of public bodies are now actually even more reluctant to give feedback because they're worried that they will then suffer or be open to legal challenge by the bidders. So a lot of these processes are very understandable, but of course it doesn't help smaller companies, particularly in terms of the bidding process. The use of certain risk criteria can make it very onerous, particularly for small companies. If a contract, they may make the judgment it's just not worth bidding for, as I said, because the value or the risk of the contract just doesn't merit them bidding. And having access to and use of approved lists. Many public bodies, particularly local authorities, will have approved lists of suppliers who they tend to go to automatically. Now, it's basically anti-competitive. You get what you can get, very cosy cartels, local cartels. Now, obviously, if you're on the approved list, then your quid's in. But if you're not, then it's very difficult to break into that business. The downside, of course, is that because it's anti-competitive, the public sector could actually be losing out. A local authority which has an approved list could actually be losing out significantly because there could be a more innovative and a better supplier who's not on their approved list. So the Barriers to Procurement report recommended that the approved list, use of approved list be banned. And the last point, the one without the bullet point, is that the pooling, often called bundling, of public contracts to create consortia contracts and framework agreements can lock out small businesses. Unfortunately, that is true occasionally, although it's always difficult. It's always difficult to get the evidence for this, but it doesn't stop even if contracts are put or aggregated into framework agreements. It doesn't mean that public bodies can't actually break those contracts up into smaller lots. For example, you might have 4 or 5 local authorities coming together for to collaborate in terms of a particular goods and services to get obviously better value for the taxpayer. But that doesn't mean to say that has to be completed in one contract. It can be broken down into smaller lots. So these are the recommendations. Very briefly, it's a very significant report. The recommendations are that the procurement process be standardised, a standard pre-qualification questionnaire be produced, and written in plain English. Often they're incredibly complex and they don't really need to be. Basically, there should be much greater transparency. All public contracts over 25k must be advertised on the Sale to Wales website. The big problem is for many small companies that each local body, each council, for example, will often have a different threshold for advertising. So you could have one business which may be dealing with 4 or 5 local authorities around them. One might have an advertising threshold of 25k, the next would be 50k, the others would be 75 or 100. Again, there should be standardisation. Competition really, should be driving this in terms of opening up the market. Again, there should be greater transparency in terms of guidance particularly for small companies, or not just small companies. And working with a company recently in South Wales, they found it extremely difficult to get through the government process because it's so complex, full of jargon, often asking for information that's not actually required. Approved lists should be banned, and SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises, should be made fully aware of the public procurement process in order to them to be able to overcome real or perceived barriers. Whoops, I've gone the wrong way. On recommendations, the recommendation is training and education. Part of the problem at the moment, particularly at the time when public expenditure is being significantly reduced, is that public bodies are now looking to save money. So a lot of the contracts which are being advertised emphasise lowest cost rather than what won't actually be better value for the local economy. So it's clear, and some of you may have heard a programme on Radio 4 last week, Phylum 4, comparing procurement practice in Wales, Scotland and England, and complementing parts of Wales for looking at procurement more imaginatively, what's called, including what are called community benefit clauses. So, for example, a contract will specify that in terms of winning business, maybe a construction company, it will give a commitment to train within the programme, within the contract, train a significant or certain number of people who are long-term unemployed, or there may be wider economic benefits that the local community can gain, rather than just giving a contract on the lowest price. And the second point there is very crucial, is that it may be strange to believe this, but most procurement in the public sector, particularly in local authorities, is actually carried out by people who are not qualified. They don't actually have qualifications in procurement. They've done it because they've done it for years, so they tend to do what they've always done. The problem is, from that horrible American phrase, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. And that's the problem. we need to open up the system, make it much more efficient, but also be able to get better value, not just for the Welsh taxpayer, but also for the local economy. At the moment, I think it's 115 procurement professionals with appropriate qualifications in the whole of the public sector in Wales. That's 22 local authorities, Welsh Government, Health Service, etc. That isn't many. So we need people who have had appropriate training. And the last point, you'll be glad to hear, is the Welsh Government, headed by Carwyn Jones, in that programme for government, which is the programme for 5 years of this Assembly term, up to 2016, the barriers to procurement report will be implemented in full. That was a commitment they made in the manifesto. I ensured when I wrote the manifesto it was in there, and Welsh Government will be delivering that. That will hopefully really provide a big change, radical change to the procurement process. As I said there, procurement must be used more imaginatively if we're going to maximise the economic benefit for Welsh companies, and indeed the Welsh economy, as well as getting better value for the Welsh pound. And finally, we need obviously better qualified, better trained professionals in Wales. And obviously the work that Dermot and his team are doing is actually right in the middle of that very important agenda. So I think Dermot and his team are very well placed for the Research Excellence Framework in a few years' time, doing cutting-edge research, but obviously which is going to have a wider application. So that's my presentation in terms of the scale of the business that's available, what Welsh Government policy is.